Welcome everybody to this Baha'i Blog interview. My name is Naysan and I'm joined here today by a dear friend, Payam Rowhani, who actually happens to be in my community as well. You know, this year is a special year for Baha'is around the world. It marks the 100th anniversary of the passing of Abdu'l-Baha. And what you hear a lot about in the faith when you, as a Baha'i, at least for myself, is you hear a lot about Abdu'l-Baha's time after he was released from prison. You hear about his time in the West, when he was in Paris, when he was in North America. But something you don't hear much about is his time in Egypt. And so I wanted to ask my dear friend Payam to join me today to talk a little bit more about Abdu'l-Baha's time in Egypt, because I personally don't know much about that time, and I thought others probably don't either. So I'm inviting Payam to have a chat with us today. So Payam, welcome, and thank you for being a part of this.
Naysan John, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure being here, being on Baha'i Blog. And I just want to tell you that, first of all, I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. I enjoy reading about history, and especially about Abdu'l-Baha on this 100th-year anniversary of his passing. And I just wanted to mention who Abdu'l-Baha is. As we all know, the eldest son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, Baha'u'llah. He was his eldest son. Baha'is consider him, as you know, the center of the covenant. He was the perfect exemplar. And everything, the Baha'i Faith, after Baha'u'llah and the Bab, of course, revolves around Abdu'l-Baha as the reflection of the powers and covenant of Baha'u'llah.
Thank you, Payam. So can you tell me a little bit about Abdu'l-Baha's time in Egypt and when he went there and why he went there? Because I know that he went there before he went to Europe, but I don't know that much about his time in Egypt and why he went.
Abdu'l-Baha, as you know, he was released, or he wasn't a prisoner anymore in 1909. In 1909, after the Young Turks Revolution in Turkey, all political and religious prisoners were freed. And Abdu'l-Baha was a free man at that time. Now, as you know, on the 21st of March of that same year, he laid the body of the Blessed Bab in his final resting place on Mount Carmel, the mausoleum of the Bab. Of course, it wasn't built at that time, but the foundation, the groundwork had been done, and he laid the bodies to rest. After this, he expresses his desire to travel and to promulgate the message of his father to the East and the West. But what happened was, he, being a prisoner, even he mentions in one of the Guardian mentions that during the darkest hours of his time in Akka, which was the last few years before his freedom, when the people and the Baha'i especially were afraid for his safety, the Guardian mentions that Abdu'l-Baha made plans of traveling and teaching the faith of his father to faraway places. Of course, as you know, he hadn't left the Holy Land in 42 years. He was upon his freedom, he decided he's going to travel. Now, Egypt, because of his vicinity, closeness to the Holy Land, and being a major port at that time, was where all travelers, when they came by ship, they came through Egypt and then to Haifa and then Akka. So even when they were initially exiled from Adrianople to come to Akka, they came through Egypt by ship. From Adrianople, when they traveled by land and then got on the ship, and they came to Egypt. Then they came to Haifa first, and from Haifa they went to Akka.
This is the Holy Family you're talking about.
Yeah, the Holy Family in 1868,
right,
when they exiled for the third time to the Holy Land of Akka. So he hadn't traveled. Now, he had traveled to Beirut before. Abdu'l-Baha had traveled outside, but that was considered part of the Holy Land. It was considered part of Palestine under the Ottoman Empire. So he hadn't left. Now, Egypt at that time was also in some ways considered to be under Ottoman rule, but only nominally so. In
Right.
reality, it wasn't so because they had their own Khedive and everything was there. So Abdu'l-Baha decides he wants to go and teach. Now, he knew, and he mentions this to one of the believers when he goes to Egypt, that I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. In
Mm.
fact, it was such a hush hush thing for him because he knew the covenant breakers might cause problems if they found out that he's leaving. So what he does is he leaves his home in the morning, goes and visits one of the Baha'i families who had just dug a new well,
Mhm.
water well. He goes there and they're so surprised to see him come to the house. They welcome him. And then he says, I've come here to taste the water, to see
Mhm.
what the water the well is producing. Because you have to remember the water wasn't very good in Akka at that time. So if you dug a well and it was good, sweet water, it was a real blessing. So he does that. Then this is about the afternoon time. Then he takes a coach, horse and a carriage, and goes up the holy mountain, goes up to Mount Carmel and visits the shrine of the Bab at that time. And then he comes back down and directly to the steamer that was going to be taking him to Port
Mm.
Said in Egypt.
Wow.
Nobody knew about it.
So he,
Now,
he he went alone.
historians even say,
Did he have any
now
companions with him?
there were two companions with him. There were two companions who traveled with him at that time, and they were the only ones who knew. But the historians and these companions also mention in their memoirs that no one else knew about this. But when you read the writings of the Guardian and the Greatest Holy Leaf, as how she took over, and she was his vice chair, she was his deputy when he was not there and took over, you would assume that he had told her about it, but told her to keep it a secret,
Right.
if you're going to do that. Even though he did write her a letter while on board that steamer, because the ships in those days to travel from Haifa to Port Said would take about 3 to 5 days because they made other stops on the way. In
Mm.
fact, the reason we know about these other stops is the moment his half brother, the breaker of the covenant, the archbreaker of Baha'u'llah's covenant, who opposed and was big enemy of Abdu'l-Baha, but the moment he found out that Abdu'l-Baha has left Haifa, everybody was in shock. This guy, more than everyone else, immediately started spreading the rumors that Abdu'l-Baha had fled.
Mm.
He had fled for his safety, he had fled for his life, because he was afraid the new Turkish government might harm him in some way. And then he went so far as to inform the chief magistrate of Haifa and Akka, or what they call the constable or chief of police at that time, that Abdu'l-Baha had run away. This chief constable, he sends a telegram to one of his men who was on one of these ports that the ship stops at. And this gentleman boards the ship that Abdu'l-Baha was on, the steamer, and goes up to Abdu'l-Baha, and he has the audacity, after seeing Abdu'l-Baha, to ask him for his identification, to
Mm.
ask him who he was so he can report accurately back to his superiors that yes, Abdu'l-Baha was on this ship. And then when he gets to Port Said, again, another one of the representatives of this person again comes to Abdu'l-Baha and confirms that it's him and he's arrived in Port Said. So this is the friendships and bribes and everything that Muhammad Ali used to give to these officials in Haifa and Akka to keep them on his side and report these.
Mm. So do we know what's the actual purpose though of the trip of Abdu'l-Baha? And once he got to Egypt, what was his plan?
Abdu'l-Baha, as far as what was in his mind, of course, none of us know exactly why, but Egypt was like a stepping stone. So Egypt was at that time considered the most intellectually advanced Arab country, or
Mm.
Muslim country. So Abdu'l-Baha went there, first of all, because he had planned on traveling to Europe and North America, as he did later on.
Uh-huh.
So his plans were there from the beginning, but he just delayed it And Egypt was logistically the place to go. But also, we have to know that the wisdom behind Abdu'l-Baha's every move is so great. He thought of so many things while doing this. And Egypt, as an Islamic country, Egypt was advanced intellectually, but in a sense, they also had a lot of problems. And Abdu'l-Baha, from what you read, you realize he wanted to launch the Baha'i faith to the Eastern world. And Egypt, so metropolitan, also had a lot of Western people there. A lot of influential Westerners were living there.
Right.
And he was able to, without giving a single public talk. See, Abdu'l-Baha's famous public talks in synagogues, in churches, in mosques, everywhere. He used to, especially in his trip to Europe and North America. In Egypt, he was there for 23 months as a whole.
Oh, wow.
In 3 different. He was there for 23 months. First time for 11 months. Then he traveled to Europe, came back, stayed 3 months. Again, 3.5 months. I'm just giving, approximate figures. And then he travels to North America, comes back, stays another 6 months, and then he goes back to the Holy Land. So he was in Egypt a total of about 23 months.
Right.
During this time, not a single public talk. For Abdu'l-Baha, when we see what he did in Europe and North America. So, but what's important is that he built the Baha'i community's image for all the East and the West in Egypt.
Right.
By his presence there, by meeting with all dignitaries, by the meeting with the royalty of Egypt. He met the Khedive of Egypt 4 times. He met him twice, but he met the crown prince, who was the Khedive's brother, 4 times. This guy was in love with Abdu'l-Baha. He even went to the US and was there with Abdu'l-Baha in the US as well, and in Europe. This is the brother who was going to take the Khedive's place when he leaves, which he did.
Wow.
So Abdu'l-Baha's visit there was very important. And then what else did they do? In Egypt, they still refer to the Baha'is as Babis because they had absolutely no idea about the Baha'i faith, even though it was so close to the Holy Land.
Right.
We had a good Baha'i community over there at that time. But they said because of all the calumnies that the Persian officials and the Ottoman officials always had in the press, in the newspapers, and by spreading it around there. By Abdu'l-Baha going there physically, in person, he showed them what the Baha'i faith is. He showed them by example what the Baha'is are. He talked to them. He met with them, poor and rich, high families, low families, intellectuals, religious leaders of all the faiths. As you know, in Egypt at that time, there were a lot of Coptic Christians.
Right.
Coptic Christians. There's still a very large population of Egypt. Christian.
Right. I was going to ask. So this is the first time Abdu'l-Baha went to Egypt was 1910, correct?
In 1911.
1911.
1910.
1910.
He went to Egypt in 1910, early September.
And he was there in Alexandria?
He was initially in Port Said, and then from Port Said, he goes to Alexandria. Now, the thing with Alexandria is the weather and the climate in Alexandria was best suited for Abdu'l-Baha. As you know, Abdu'l-Baha had been in prison since he was 9 years old.
Right.
In prison and in exile. And he suffered a lot. And he had a lot of illnesses and ill health.
Right.
He had asthma. Abdu'l-Baha had asthma. Most of us didn't know that. He had frostbite. He used to wear shoes that were bigger than his feet because of the pain in his toes.
Wow. So he went in 1910 and he was, he had been a prisoner all his life. And I think he was 66 years old.
Yes, he was 66 he was 66. Right. I imagine a man of 66 of such ill health, and he gives this as an example. He says, if I can do it, everybody can do it.
Right.
To serve humanity, we all have to do things. And then in one of his tablets over there, he mentions that Even when I sleep, it's not for the pleasure. It's just to build my health, build my strength so I can talk better, I can explain things better, I have the health to do it. That's why I sleep. Otherwise, I would spend my whole time in serving the faith. You know, in Egypt in 1910, when Abdu'l-Baha visited in early September. Now, we don't know the exact date of Abdu'l-Baha leaving the Holy Land. We only know that it was early September, and the Guardian also mentions early September. Because it was such a secret, nobody really knew until a few days later. And another thing is that the moment he sets sail, when he writes a letter to the greatest holy leaf, his sister, Bahiya Khanum, supposedly informing her of his leaving, and then he writes to Shori Effendi also, telling him to come. So Shori Effendi and three other of the believers were the first ones who went there to visit Abdu'l-Baha in Egypt. He asked them to come over. But the thing with Abdu'l-Baha was, he was grooming Shori Effendi to become the guardian of the faith. He had already put him down in his will and testament, which was written before his trips to the West, or to Egypt even. And Shori Effendi, when he was about 7 or 8, had already been designated as the guardian in Abdu'l-Baha's will and testament. In fact, as you know, Abdu'l-Baha was grooming Shori Effendi to become the guardian of the Baha'i faith. On the other hand, Abdu'l-Baha had to be very careful in order for nobody to find out about the station of Shori Effendi, because he was afraid and scared for his safety.
Right.
In fact, you tell Shori Effendi, I think you know this, that when you do go visit your relatives and all, and the Covenant Bakers, sometimes there might be somewhere, do not drink coffee or anything over there, because he was scared of poison. And killing someone with poison was the most common way of murder to get away with at that time. Everywhere in the world, there's always poison. Now, as you know, the atmosphere in Egypt in 1910, when Abdu'l-Baha goes to Egypt, was pretty civil. Egypt was very metropolitan. In fact, they had electric tram cars that Abdu'l-Baha used to take. And one of the friends writes on how he used to stand in line with the rest of the people, even though everybody was, after a while, they knew who he was, and he was such a special personality. But they used to stand in line, he used to make his own change and pay and go and sit. Very democratically. This is how he behaved. Now, Egypt has a big population of Coptic Christians. And just a few years before Abdu'l-Baha's visit there was a big clash, violent clash between the Muslims and the Coptic Christians. A lot of them. Abdu'l-Baha went there. He taught them, he talked to them, to the Christian leaders, to the Muslim leaders, about the brotherhood of man, about love and unity, and how we can all coexist, and we should coexist, and told them of ways, practical ways of how we can achieve this. And it brought about a lot of understanding and peace among these two different religious groups. These are just the small things that his visit to Egypt achieved, other than informing them and giving them a correct impression of the Baha'i faith, which all the newspapers, the dignitaries, the heads of the religion on all sides, the royalty, all of them became aware. And the newspapers and the different government newspapers, independent newspapers in Persian, in Turkish, in Arabic, started to refer to Abdu'l-Baha as His Eminence, as this great person. Whereas initially, when he hadn't still visited for many years, they used to refer very badly to the Baha'is and the Baha'i faith. Right. And now everything changed just because of his physical presence in Egypt. He's achieved one main goal. One of the beautiful stories, I'll tell you this now before I forget, is one of the friends, Baha'i friends in Egypt. He was on the street, and there's this poor man on the side of the road, and he talks to him, and then the guy asks him about, because he was Persian, so he asked him about, Persian here in Egypt and stuff, and this guy wants to explain. He says, I'm a Baha'i, and thinking that the poor man doesn't know what Baha'i is, he tries to tell the guy, the newspaper and articles, everything nowadays, since there was no TV and internet, but the newspaper is all mentioning about this person. They have his picture in the newspaper, this old man, Abdu'l-Baha, his name is. And the poor man looks at the Baha'i and says, yeah, I know him. He's been to my house. We had food together. And then this guy is in shock because Abdu'l-Baha is, visiting these people, and then he's visiting the like the Khedive of Egypt. Khedive means like the king, the vicegerent, the ruler of Egypt on one side, and these poor people in their houses on the other, and the religious leaders on this side. He's meeting everybody, and he's spreading this message of love and brotherhood for the whole world, everyone.
Wow. So where do we find out more about Abdu'l-Baha in Egypt? Are there any books that you recommend or?
About Abdu'l-Baha in Egypt, there are a few. Now, Hassan Balusi, the beloved hand of the cause of God, he studied Abdu'l-Baha in depth, and he has his books, the one on Abdu'l-Baha, and he has a lot of other papers published about Abdu'l-Baha. But the main source of information about Abdu'l-Baha's trips in Egypt come from Ahmad Sohrab's diary.
Mhm.
As you know, Ahmad Sohrab, his real name was Ahmad Isfahani.
Mhm.
He was with Abdu'l-Baha during the time in Egypt. He travels to the west and came back. So he was with Abdu'l-Baha for 7 years
Wow.
totally, and he kept a very in-depth diary. And it's called Sohrab's diary.
Are those available in English? Do you know?
I know they're available online. People can read them. It's very in-depth. It's day by day. Some of
Right.
the months, day by day is written. This is where you find out about, just subtly reading the notes. Then when you look at it overall, you see Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the faith, was with Abdu'l-Baha a long time in Egypt. He
Wow.
was with him on and off. Go back to the Holy Land for his schooling. And this kid is now, this Shoghi Effendi, this kid, he was 14 years old.
Right.
He's going back to the Holy Land for school. And the moment school is off, the moment there's a small vacation, he's back with his grandfather,
Wow.
Abdu'l-Baha, in Egypt. And then he mentions one of the times when Ahmad Sohrab, he walks into the room, Abdu'l-Baha had called him, and then he hears in the other room, Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, and Abdu'l-Baha is teaching Shoghi Effendi how to chant correctly, how to chant the prayers correctly. So
Wow.
he was grooming him and training him right from day one, but he didn't want anyone to know. In fact, as you know, Shoghi Effendi was supposed to be from Egypt when they left to Naples and then to New York on the steamer Cedric. Shoghi Effendi was with him, but in Naples, they got him off the boat because the physician who was on the steamer, they have a physician on the steamer always with a lot of people. He thought incorrectly that these Abdu'l-Baha and his companions were Turkish, and he was Italian. It was an Italian steamer, and he was prejudiced towards the Turks. So he assumed Abdu'l-Baha and these travelers are Turks, and started to discriminate against them. He accused one of the people who was traveling with Abdu'l-Baha, Khosrow, of having an eye infection. And when he saw how Abdu'l-Baha loved this young boy, which is his grandson, Shoghi Effendi, he also said these Shoghi Effendi and another one of the believers who were with him, their eyes are also infected because this disease is contagious. So we got to get them off the boat. And in Naples, they forced Shoghi Effendi off the boat. And Ruhiya Khanum, the guardian's wife, Ahmadul-Baha Ruhiya Khanum, explains in her writings, in her memoirs, how this 14-year-old boy must have felt. His love for his grandfather, wanted to go to this beautiful new world called America, on the North American continent, and how he was denied this so unjustly.
Oh.
But there's another story I want to tell you about is when he was in Egypt, one day one of the pilgrims comes and they inform Abdu'l-Baha that the son of Baha'u'llah's eldest brother has come to visit you. So that means his first cousin, Abdu'l-Baha's first cousin has come to visit him, Fazrullah. So Abdu'l-Baha is very excited to meet him. He says, I went there and they talked. And then Ahmad Sohrab writes that there was no one there but them talking about the old days. And Abdu'l-Baha was saying stories about the old days. And he was hearing what Fazrullah had to say about the old days, his first cousin. And then Ahmad Sohrab says, I so wish I was there to hear those stories about Abdu'l-Baha's childhood and about Baha'u'llah's time and these really personal stories. He says, I wish I was there. The way he writes it is like, he says, I wish I was a fly on the wall,
Mm.
to hear all these stories. So that was also interesting that he met his first, Abdu'l-Baha met his first cousin and they talked and
Wow.
got together and read about the old.
Wow. Are a lot of these documented at the time in Egypt?
As you know, one of the first Baha'i periodicals or publications was the Baha'i News. Initially, it was called Baha'i News, and then later it came to be called Star of the West. This Star of the West publication, which is so famous, it was initially called Baha'i News. It's a publication in the US. It started on the 1st of Nowruz, 1909. Same date that Abdu'l-Baha laid the body of the Bab in his final resting place.
Hmm.
So this publication, you were asking me about having access to these articles that were printed in the Egyptian newspapers in Persian, Turkish, and Arabic, all of them. Yes, these the friends who were there in Egypt at that time used to send copies of these to Star of the West, and Star of the West used to print them.
Oh, wow.
Used to copy articles and say what they're talking about the Baha'i Faith. All the calumnies, all the lies that were there previously had completely changed with the visit of Abdu'l-Baha. Just after a few months there, completely everybody had done a total 180.
Hmm.
The publishers, the artists, the literary artists, the politicians, the religious leaders, everybody's views on the faith had changed because of it. Now, these articles are available. They've been published throughout these years that Abdu'l-Baha, from then to his last days on November 28, 1921, when he passed away, they used to regularly print these articles that were printed originally in the papers in Egypt. The reason I mentioned 21st of March, which is the first day of Nowruz, that this periodical started, is because Abdu'l-Baha in one of his tablets says, this is what we should do on Nowruz. Start a new endeavor, start a new enterprise that's going to be helpful, some kind of initiative that is going to be beneficial to the human race. It says Nowruz is a good time to start this. So this is, he laid the body of the Bab to rest on the 21st of Nowruz, or 21st of March, which is the first day of Nowruz. And the publication started then. And a lot of other things that Baha'is want to start, if it's close to that date, they will choose 21st of March as launching date.
We actually started Baha'i Blog right around Nowruz, 10 years ago. Yeah. So, yeah, awesome. That's cool. I didn't know that.
What I wanted to say also is, we always imagine Abdu'l-Baha was in Egypt, the Holy Family was in Akka and Haifa, and they were in Abdu'l-Baha. But we have to know that they were, the Holy Family, were constantly visiting Abdu'l-Baha in Egypt.
Right.
His sister, greatest holy leaf, his wife, his daughters, they all used to come and go. And every time they came, Shaykh Effendi was with them. And they would leave and he would stay and then he would go back alone. Next group came, he was there. And you have to know that Egypt was a place for improving your health, weather-wise, that even the greatest holy leaf, after the passing away of Baha'u'llah, her father, in 1892, Abdu'l-Baha sent her to Egypt to improve her health because she was so devastated by the passing of her father. The Munira Khanum, Abdu'l-Baha's wife, visited Egypt. His daughters used to visit. This is all before Abdu'l-Baha himself went. Abdu'l-Baha never could leave. He was a prisoner. But the family were allowed these concessions. The government edict was for Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah, but he had asked them to relieve his family, even the covenant breakers, from this imprisonment of these restrictions that they were facing. So only Abdu'l-Baha bore the whole weight of all these restrictions so that the family could be free. So they used to constantly come and visit him. So it wasn't like he was there alone or nobody there with him. But
Right.
he was constantly writing. As you know, Abdu'l-Baha's stories, and Ahmad Sorab mentions it a number of times. Constantly, he would be talking to people and at the same time writing tablets.
Wow.
That's like something, me personally, I cannot even imagine. Like multitasking, this is taking multitasking to another level where you're communicating, socializing, and talking to people, and then at the same time, you're writing a tablet. Someone.
Yeah. Wow.
So this
Wow.
is Abdul-Baha. The whole time, you see, 23 months he was there, he wasn't vacationing, not one day. Every day from morning to night, visiting people or people visiting him, going about. Rarely you hear about him walking in a park because they had beautiful parks in Egypt at that time, especially in Alexandria. But even then, when he was walking, he was talking to someone, dictating something to his secretary to write. So constantly he was doing the Lord's work, basically.
Wow.
That's what teaches us.
So what do you think then we can all take away from this, from Abdu'l-Baha's time in Egypt or times in Egypt? I mean, what do you think all of us can walk away with from that experience?
See, personally, I'm 58 years old, and I feel like, oh, I'm too old now to do this and to do that. Abdu'l-Baha was 10 years older than me. Didn't have any of the luxuries that I've had in my life. And imagine at that age, at the age of 67, 68, when he went to the US, 69, and he was constantly talking about the faith and spreading the message of love and unity, his father's message, Baha'u'llah's message to the world. He took personal responsibility for this. And this, as a perfect exemplar of the Baha'i faith, all of us can learn. It's never too late.
Mm.
Okay, you don't want to travel so far and stuff. Your next door neighbor, your friends, tell them about the faith. Bring about this new world order that we want to talk about. This is what I always get from history. I read history and then I see, how can I implement it in my life? How can I use Abdu'l-Baha as my example and do, I can never go through what he went through.
Mm.
More than 40 years of suffering, and still he wasn't ready to rest.
Mm.
He wanted to do more. He says he says, the Guardian says, he made his plans, and the moment the gates opened, he traveled. Now, of course, he went to Egypt with the intention of immediately going to Europe and North America, but his health was so bad that he was forced to stay for 11 months
Mm.
just to recuperate so he could take this trip to the US. 238 days in the US. The
Yeah.
ship itself takes 14 days travel, 14 days to go from Egypt to New York. Now, they're not these luxury liners that we have today. It's
Mm.
not the Titanic, These are a lot of hardships on these ships, a lot of hardships in any of these places. Like an electric tram train he talks about was such a luxury.
Mm.
It was always by carriage and horse and long trips.
Mm.
So, but he still did all this. I mean, who am I, or what all of us as Baha'is, we can all do our part and help bring about this new world order that Abdu'l-Baha so strongly was pushing to bring about.
Great. Thank you so much, Payam John. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for the conversation and shedding some light on Abdu'l-Baha's time in Egypt. Really, really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to share things that I read and about it. It was always a pleasure. Naysan John, your lovely Baha'i blog, which we all take so much from. Every time there's a new post, we're all on there and enjoying it. And
Thank you.
really nice. It's nice. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Appreciate that.